Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table, discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, you're up this week. What have you brought to the table today?
I'm bringing a few things about the war in Sudan. The pieces both critique the lack of media coverage in Sudan, and when it is covered, they critique the way that it is covered.
Yes.
And talk about how that's limited and misleading. We read a piece called 1 Year of Sudan War Sparks Fear of Another Genocide, which was written by Kate Bartlett and published by NPR in just last month in April. And the other was a part of a news show on the Al Jazeera network called The Listening Post, hosted by Richard Gisbert. The episode of this show is called Sudan, A Savage War and Toxic Information Battle. And both of these pieces provide some insight into the war and what's been happening. I think the basics, right?
Yeah.
So I figured we'd start there with a basic summary of what's going on based on what we read here.
Okay.
Read and or watched.
Yeah.
So the Sudanese Armed Forces, the SAF, is fighting with the Rapid Support Forces, which are the rebel group. There is external international support that is occurring on each side. So the SAF is backed by Iran and Egypt, and the RSF is backed by the Russian militia group Wagner, and potentially the United Arab Emirates, though they publicly deny this.
Yeah.
In addition to these two armies, there are Sudan resistance committees, which are informal groups who planned civil disobedience against the previous dictator, Omar al-Bashir. And that ultimately led to him being ousted as the dictator, which led to a revolution, which led to eventually the splintering of these two groups who were working together to create a shared government. So these resistance committees have been working to make sure hospitals are well supplied and evacuating civilians from areas where the SAF and the RSF are fighting. So now that we have the news summary out of the way,
That was very good.
where do you want to start? What stood out to you from these two pieces?
Yeah, that was a very good news summary. Thank you for that. I think it's good for everyone to have some context for maybe what we're about to talk about, and that's
Well, and it helped me. Writing it out helped me out.
Yeah, and that's more than I knew before I started to read this piece and watch this piece. So so thanks for that. And I'm also really glad that we're getting to talk about the crisis that's taking place in Sudan, because as you said at the top, it really hasn't been reported on in the news as much as other big news stories like the war in Gaza and what's taking place in Ukraine even. And that
Or the Met Gala.
Or the Met Gala. He's got jokes, everyone, but they're facts. And to be fair, it's a real shame, when you really find out what's been going on for this past year. In the NPR piece, they quote the international president of Doctors Without Borders. His name is Dr. Christos Christou. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, but he recently said, quote, "Sudan is one of the worst crises the world has seen for decades." And it just struck me, for decades? So in and of itself, I think that's awful. But the other troubling thing that the NPR piece reminded me of is that the Darfur region of Sudan was plagued by genocide just 20 years ago. And I remember that. I have recollection of that and it's in our lifetime, obviously. The NPR piece quoted Eric Reeves, who's an American scholar and researcher on Sudan. And he's worried that Sudan is on the verge of becoming a failed state. And in fact, I didn't write this down, but someone in the Al Jazeera piece also said that. She said that in her remarks in that video. But Eric Reeves told NPR, quote, "There's nothing like the humanitarian presence there was in the early years of the genocide." And he also said that the situation now could be even worse than it was back in 2003. And so to me, all of this really opened my eyes. And I think if folks engage with this as well, it should open your eyes to what's going on there. And more importantly, it made me think about what can we do to help, which I'm sure we're going to talk about too.
Yeah, a lot of this was just, I think, astounding.
Yeah.
To think about, because as you said, I didn't know much. I knew that there was crisis happening, but really that's kind of it. And I had heard other things about other places around the world, but not Sudan as much.
No.
But one of the major stories here is just how many people have been displaced and need aid.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
9 million people have been displaced from their homes, and 25 million people need aid, according to the Listening Post episode that we watched, which is from late April. So it's just a few weeks old.
Yep.
and 18 million are facing acute hunger, according to UN humanitarian agencies that were quoted in both pieces, maybe just NPR, I don't remember which. Wow. But those numbers are just so hard to wrap my head around.
Absolutely.
It's so many people to become abstract.
Yes.
Almost. It's just hard to fathom what that means.
Yeah.
And then in the NPR article, it says, quote, UN and non-governmental aid agencies have warned that about 230,000 children, pregnant women, and new mothers are likely to die from hunger in the coming months. Wow. So this is a huge humanitarian crisis that's happening in the midst of these two factions really fighting against one another for political control of the country, while seemingly actively harming people who get in their way, and creating famine conditions. Right. And there, as you mentioned, there aren't the same levels of support or humanitarian aid or organizations that are present now as there were the last time there was a huge crisis.
Right.
There.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm with you. It's hard to fathom is a good word and comprehend those numbers, and particularly I think the 230-some thousand women and children they're predicting might die from hunger. I think that's just kind of unthinkable. And so it's something we all need to be attuned to and paying attention to and knowledgeable about. What is also unthinkable to me, and I kind of feel like I should preface this with a trigger warning around violence and sexual assault, but what's also unimaginable and vile and heartbreaking about what's going on is the fact that rape is also being used as a weapon of war in Sudan right now. So the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas Greenfield, is quoted in the NPR piece, and she says, quote, "Girls have been kidnapped from the streets as they walk to school in Khartoum. They have been handcuffed to the back of trucks and transported to Darfur," she said. And to me, the quote stops there. I don't think we need to go any further and think about what that means and what happens after they're kidnapped. But to me, it's thinking about the scale of the violence that's taking place there, the scale of the violence that's taking place to real people there, the violence that's taking place to the ecosystem and the terrain. And we've talked about that when we talked about Gaza. And as you talk about these political factions are fighting one another, these regimes are fighting one another, but real people are victims of this war. And it makes me angry to think about that. It's such a shame that we're not seeing the coverage of this, and it's not getting the coverage it warrants. And that is something that I think has to change.
Yeah, absolutely. Because there's another article I clicked on while watching the listening post. It was on the side of the Al Jazeera site so it was a newer article. And it's called "Sudan's Paramilitary RSF Accused of Ethnic Cleansing in West Darfur." So this is about a report from the Human Rights Watch, which was released on May 9th, so very, very recent. Wow. This report focused on the ethnic cleansing that the RSF conducted in El Geneina, which targeted Masalit ethnic communities. So the RSF looted, burned, shelled, and razed entire neighborhoods to the ground and left hundreds of thousands of people as refugees due to this violence in this neighborhood. Wow. And this included mass torture, rape, and looting, as you mentioned. I also saw something horrific about things that they did to children. Yeah. Because I saw something else on social media after I was searching this because the algorithm figured out that I was interested in learning more here. Yeah. So they found me wherever it was. And somebody was talking about this report and just, I won't talk about it here, but it's horrific. Yeah. Like the things that the RSF is doing to kids. And so it's all in that report, which so many things. It's really awful what's happening.
I mean, anytime you refer to ethnic cleansing, like we've got a serious atrocity taking place here. I didn't click on anything else because when I watched that listening post episode on the Al Jazeera website, I think, first of all, I think it's a must watch. I think everyone should really watch it.
It was very good and quoted a whole lot of people.
A whole lot of people. There's really great news coverage about what's taking place here. And while it's difficult to watch the displacement and the hunger and the violence and the destruction that's been taking place, it's something that I think we all need to know about and what's going on there. In that listening post episode, the journalist narrating it, he names what's going on in Gaza and in Ukraine and talks about how those things are horrendous and tragic. But he also says, quote, "Neither of those conflicts are on the scale of what has unfolded in Sudan and the number of people affected." And the episode also names some of the reasons why Sudan isn't getting the news coverage it should be getting, which I thought was an important piece of this. And you talked about this at the top. So much of it, I think, has to do with racism embedded in our news media around how Africa is covered by major news outlets. And I think the fact that there are major state players involved in this war. You mentioned the UAE, Russia, and the messiness there with the international relations of those countries and with the rest of the world and the violence in which they're inflicting around the world. And so to me, all of that, again, when you clear all of that out, that leaves real people. You mentioned those numbers earlier, 9 million, 25 million, 18 million. I mean, these are real people in real crisis in need of real aid. And that's what I think we need to be focused on.
Yeah, I think that the lack of coverage is, as you said, racism embedded in news media, particularly in the West. But I think it's also it's easy to write this off as two warring factions.
Yes.
Struggling for control over the country and not picking up on all this humanitarian aspect to it as well, which is easy for the media to ignore, for people in the West to ignore, because it's happening in Africa. There's a particular narrative and mindset that is connected there.
Oh, right? Absolutely.
Hey there, folks. Sorry for the interruption, but we wanted to invite you to join us over on Patreon.
Yeah, we're so excited to be on Patreon and be able to create some additional content and opportunities for us to learn and unlearn together.
That's right. We'll be rolling out some new ways you can join us in our collective learning and unlearning over the next few weeks.
So you can join for free and get some regular updates from us. And we'll also have paid tiers available as well, with extra content available each month.
You can find us at patreon.com/interdependent-study and join us today.
That's right. You can join right now at patreon.com/interdependent-study. Okay, now back to the episode.
Patreon.com/interdependent-study. All right, well, let's talk about application. How do we apply what we've learned from these articles to our day-to-day lives? My application, I think, is really trying to understand how I can support Sudan resistance committees that are continuing their work after their successful ousting of the previous dictator al-Bashir. To learn more, to follow and understand what they're doing, there are a few hashtags we can follow on different sites, including hashtag Keep Eyes on Sudan, I Am the Sudan Revolution, Sudan Uprising, and Stand with Sudan.
Okay.
These hashtags have people sharing, what they're doing on the ground and organizing the crowdfunding campaigns to help refugees get out and with their families. They're also sharing news like the Human Rights Watch report that I mentioned earlier.
Oh, that's great.
There's a lot of insightful information that people are sharing there that might help us understand more about what's happening beyond the lack of news coverage and the warped news coverage that we do get.
Yeah, that's some really great application. I think I'll just co-sign that. And it's also, it speaks to this idea that we also are having to get news from social media, for better or for worse. Folks are on the ground and sharing this atrocity with the world. And again, it's important for us to know about it. And so I think, my application is that I think first and foremost, we have to educate ourselves about what's been taking place in the Sudan, and in the same way that we're learning about and seeing and engaging in what's happening in other places in the world, we have to do that here too. And then I think, as you said, we have to figure out what we can do to support the humanitarian efforts there. I also think we have to make it clear to our elected officials that, we have the capacity to care about more than one issue, more than one situation at a time, and that we want peace and justice and liberation in places like Sudan as well. And so the same way that people are making their voices heard and making it clear what we stand for as it relates to places like Palestine, we should also be doing the same for the Sudanese people, I think.
Yeah. Yes. 100%. One of the things that you said, we're turning to social media to learn more about what's happening here. One of the things that was interesting in the Al Jazeera piece, the listening post, was they talked about how the RSF actually took over a news channel in Sudan for a little bit, and they didn't do much with it because they recognized that the news was really going through social media anyway.
Right.
And the context there is that not everybody has access to the internet all of the time to even be able to share things on social media, but that's where people are turning to for news outside of the standard things like news stations or papers or what have you. So yeah, it's happening there too. People are sharing things there to learn more about what's going on. All right, let's talk about homework.
Okay.
What do we want to do to continue learning beyond our conversation today? I think my homework is to follow some of those hashtags and learn more from people and read some more stuff about this, like the report I mentioned from the Human Rights Watch. But I also wanted to highlight that international organizations like Save the Children and the International Rescue Committee are also doing work to support refugees in Sudan.
Yes.
So I think the homework here is figuring out what are ways that I can support. Can I send $5 to Save the Children or International Rescue Committee or to somebody's crowdfunding campaign to support them being able to get out of the situation that they're in and survive this crisis? Yeah, how are we supporting refugees, really, I think is the homework, because there's millions of them.
Yeah, and they need some support. Absolutely. I love that homework. I didn't think to look up any hashtags and do that work, so I definitely want to do that. I'm glad you gave us some options there as places to start. I'm also glad that you mentioned the International Rescue Committee. I was outraged particularly after watching the Al Jazeera piece, because again, there's just some horrific images and things taking place over there. And so I read up a little bit about what they've been doing to help. So they said this on their website, quote, "Since the start of the conflict, the IRC has adapted and scaled up our programming in Sudan to address increased humanitarian needs. We are supporting people who have been displaced internally through economic empowerment services, health and nutrition, and water, sanitation, and hygiene programs. The IRC also provides protection and empowerment services for women and children, including for gender-based violence survivors. We have established offices in new regions, including Port Sudan, and launched an emergency response in White Nile State to deliver cash assistance, safe water, and sanitation and hygiene services to vulnerable communities. We are also working to establish a presence in new locations, such as the River Nile and Darfur, to address gaps in humanitarian coverage and expand our programming in response to the enduring humanitarian crisis." And so, they are, yes, if I can joke a little, they're in the streets, they're doing the work. And so my homework is just to amplify and support their work. I certainly, you talked about $5, I certainly will be donating some money to the IRC. And if folks are able, I would encourage you to do that as well. But I love that you also brought up some of the other international organizations doing this work as well. So there are folks there are folks engaged in this work. And my plea for everyone listening would be to figure out how you can also support their efforts.
Yes. And I think it's important. They're doing work both, I think, to help people find other places to go.
Yes.
But also survive what's happening there and continue to live there as their home. Right. So I think we have to hold both of it. Like, what do people want?
Yes.
And how do we support them in what they want, given the crisis that they're facing?
Or what they're able to do. Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And to have these basic human needs met despite the chaos around you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, that's it for our conversation today. There's more to learn here. This is a very surface level conversation.
Yes, but thank you for bringing this to the table. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, but you're up next time. So what are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
Yes. All right. So for next week, I'm bringing an article from Inquest to the table for us. We've read a few pieces from them before, so I'm excited to check out another one. The piece I'm bringing is called For the People's Health by Christian Farias. Farias is a senior editor and a founding editor of Inquest, actually. And he's also a legal journalist who's written for lots of publications over the years. This particular piece in Inquest was published just back in late April, so it's still relatively new. The byline of the piece we're reading is, quote, "Abolition and public health go hand in hand. Organizers are embracing both as they pursue decarceral projects that center everyone's well-being." And it's a pretty long piece, so I have not read it in full at all, but it offers a bit of the history of abolitionist public health organizing that's taken place throughout history. I'm thinking even like the Black Panthers and other organizations like it, all the way to today and what's taking place today to support true public health. And it makes the argument for why this work is important. So I'm very much so looking forward to reading it and talking about it next week.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds great. And is in line with some of the stuff we've read before from interrupting criminalization and other stuff. So awesome.
Absolutely.
Continue learning around health abolition. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, Share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram and TikTok. Check us out on YouTube and sign up to join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. We'll talk to you next week.